in your inbox as well. Otherwise, I think that's all I have. So, Lynn, go right ahead.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks to those of you who've tuned in and are in attendance here at the April Director's Cut. We're talking February production and pretty significant decrease in production. Justin tells me it's the largest production drop we've had in over 2 years. The last time it dropped this amount or more was in December of 2016, and at that time it was weather again. So industry suffered, I would say, from frostbite in February. Oil production was down 5%, 69,000 barrels a day. It stayed over 1.3 million, but a pretty significant drop. And a major drop in terms of the number of conventional wells produced, and I'll talk about that in just a second. On the natural gas front, also a drop, 90 million a day, 3%. So again, we see the gas oil ratio continuing to increase. Gas dropped less than oil. Overall, 300 less wells producing in February than there were in January. And there were actually more Bakken wells producing, but the conventional wells, the old vertical wells, there were over 400 of those wells that went idle. And so we saw our idle well count really skyrocket in February. We'll be keeping an eye on that to see where that goes. Completions were down significantly. They were fairly stable in the 90 to 110 numbers December and January, but they dropped into the upper 50s in February. And you would expect that with the severe cold weather that we had. It's very difficult to move and heat frac water for well completions. So we saw the number of wells waiting on completions go up, not dramatically, but it's back to almost 900 wells waiting on completions. And a really big increase, 10% increase in the inactive well counts. Wells that were just left idle because they went down for one reason or another, and it wasn't economic to put a workover rig on them or move snow or whatever it would take. So we're at almost 1,700 wells in the inactive category. We'll be monitoring that closely. I wouldn't expect those wells to come on production, though, until road restrictions go off, because moving workover rigs is a big issue when you have road restrictions on. Crude oil takeaway capacity is fine, but we have to address the threat that we have from the West Coast. We've been actively engaged in working with the legislature in the state of Washington on a piece of legislation. Senate Bill 5579 out in Washington would impose a very restrictive vapor pressure limit on crude oil being offloaded from rail cars in the state of Washington. And it doesn't specify what standard that vapor pressure would be. In other words, it doesn't tell what kind of a vapor pressure it is, whether it's true or crude oil or reed, but in any case, it's 9 psi. And it would severely devalue Bakken crude oil and eliminate hundreds of jobs in the state of Washington. Typically between 175,000, 225,000 barrels a day goes out there by rail car. And so it is a significant issue to the state of North Dakota, and we're very engaged in trying to work out a solution. It has gotten a due pass. It was completely amended by the Washington State House, and it got a due pass by them. It has not been voted on the floor, and I know that the Western States Petroleum Association is working very hard to try to get some additional amendments to make it possible to meet the intent of the legislation. So we'll take questions on that. Interestingly enough, Fort Berthold Reservation went in the opposite direction again. Overall state oil production was down, but on Fort Berthold it was up 3,000 barrels a day. Active wells was down statewide, but on Fort Berthold it was up by 12. And so you can kind of see the counter-cyclical nature of the reservation and the geology there. It often moves in an opposite direction somewhat to the rest of the state. Natural gas prices have just not kept pace with crude oil prices. So crude oil prices have been increasing just steadily, almost day by day. Natural gas prices, on the other hand, have not, even though natural gas in storage is significantly below the 5-year average. So we're at a situation now where the value of a barrel of crude oil is 23 times the value of 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. And on a BTU basis, it should be 6 to 1. So natural gas is incredibly cheap at this point. And that brings us to the gas capture part of the equation. So gas capture also was down. The daily amount captured was down by 88 million, down 4%. And the flaring percentages then were up from about 18.6% to over 19%. So we're certainly moving in the wrong direction there. There's a lot of infrastructure either being built or planned for this summer. So I think that's going to turn around by year-end 2019, but it's not going to turn around in the immediate near-term future. So we again saw deterioration in gas capture on Fort Berthold, with the non-Fort Berthold capture at 84% and Fort Berthold at 69%. And that's really where our issue is. Part of the problem there is that there was some new valuation requirements that came out from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Department of Interior. And as a result of that, until that gets all sorted out, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Newtown has stopped issuing rights-of-way. So no new pad construction, no pipeline right-of-way expansions, and so construction there has really come to a halt. And we've got to get this thing sorted out before the construction season comes. Just one more thing on gas capture. We estimate on a monthly basis, based on the data we have coming in and then some anecdotal information, about 52,000 barrels a day of production restrictions as a result of companies trying to meet their gas capture goals. And so of the roughly 70,000 barrels a day production drop we saw, about 52,000 of that can be attributed to companies restricting production in order to meet gas capture goals. So again, it's going to be an issue through the remainder of the year. Lastly, on the federal front, we continue to have discussions with the Bureau of Land Management, trying to work out an agreement where the state would implement the new venting and flaring rule that was revised in 2018. I don't know if we're going to reach an agreement, but we continue to have discussions and we're still working on it. So that's our story for the month of February. We anticipated this and we've been warning people ever since the weather turned really cold on us in mid-January that February was going to be a difficult month, and it certainly has panned out to be that way. Production down 5% on oil, 3% on gas. Gas capture down about 4%, and a struggle. Completions way down and idle wells way up. So definitely a bad case of frostbite in the month of February. Happy to take questions.
How's McKenzie County looking like?
So yeah, so the question here is, how's McKenzie County looking? And McKenzie County is like the sole bright spot in all of this. McKenzie County really is the core area. And even though production for the month was down, McKenzie County's daily rate actually was slightly up. So yeah, so McKenzie County definitely runs counter-cyclical to the rest of the state as well. It's really the heart of the Bakken, and that area between Watford City and Newtown never really saw a slowdown like the rest of the state did, and kept working even during the cold weather months.
I've got one question here related to the bill in Washington. If that bill does become law, and some crude is displaced, is there, and maybe Justin can also speak to this when he gets back, but is there pipeline capacity to handle that displaced crude, or where would you anticipate that crude to go if it can't go to Washington?
Yeah, and I will defer that to Justin. My understanding on that whole situation is that all of the pipeline capacity is full, and so that crude oil would have to find a new home from rail transportation, most likely the Gulf of Mexico for export. But Justin can probably be a good idea to ask his thoughts on that as well. One thing about that bill is that there's a trigger built in there, which will almost immediately trigger a clock, but the new vapor pressure limit doesn't kick in for 2 years. So there's going to be a transition period there. The intent of the bill was to give producers in North Dakota a 2-year window to build infrastructure to reduce the vapor pressure of Bakken crude oil. The fact is that the vapor pressure limit they've set would devalue the crude oil so badly that all it's really going to do is give them a 2-year window to find a new market, because it really takes all of the what I want to say, the Bakken premium value out of the crude oil to drop its vapor pressure to 9 psi. So there's a question coming up for you on if Washington Senate Bill 5579 kicks in, where would you anticipate that crude oil moving to? Where might it go?
Any other questions?
Yes, 5%. I believe that's the largest drop since December 16, you said?
Yes, that's correct.
Is that a huge drop or just the largest in recent history, or could you characterize it for us?
Sure. So the question was the 5%, how does that kind of fit into the overall thing? And I chuckled when I thought of, well, it was only 69,000 barrels a day, but I can actually remember working in this job when the state only produced a little bit more than that. So when I started this job, a 69,000 barrel a day reduction would have basically wiped out North Dakota's production. Not a huge drop, and very temporary. So when you're producing 1.4 million barrels a day, 5% is significant, but in terms of revenues and all of that, oil prices actually increased more rapidly than production dropped. So it'll be more than offset by the increase in prices. So,
thank you.
And I do have one other question, and I'll just also include that we have some information on our website in regards to the gas capture policy. But the restrictions that you spoke about, are we still awarding some of those force majeures to companies not connected to plants? And do you expect any forced shut-ins or anything like that as flaring continues to increase? Or maybe characterizing what some of those force majeures include?
Sure. So yes, we still are getting a significant number of force majeure letters and also capacity curtailment letters. Because we're producing more natural gas than we have processing capacity, One Oak and some of the other processors are issuing letters of capacity curtailment, and we're still granting exceptions to production restrictions on that basis. Now, by the end of the year, we should have more processing capacity than production. And so I anticipate that we're going to stop granting those kind of variances off of the production restrictions. We have, I think Caitlin told me, 3 companies that she's looking at for possible production restrictions. It takes her, a couple of weeks after the production comes in to sort out whether they have any credits from earlier months, or if they can go and get a force majeure letter or something like that. So I can't really speak as to whether somebody's going to end up with production restrictions. But we've had a couple of companies over the last 2 years that have actually ended up with production restrictions, but it's rare.
Any other questions for Lynn?
Thanks.
TV. It's on. It'll just take a second. There we go. You good on your end? Okay, well, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Justin Krinkstead, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We'll get right into covering some of the topics that were mentioned by Lynn and so get a little bit deeper on some of the other side of the midstream industry. So we look at production, again, the update around the region. Eastern Montana, South Dakota, fairly steady in January. I'm anticipating once we see those February numbers out of those neighboring states that share our midstream industry, that we'll see some production declines as well. The weather would have at least equally impacted those regions likely as well. And also, if you look 2019 to 2018, about a 230,000 barrel a day increase when we look at January of 2018 to January of 2019. So region-wide, a tremendous amount of year-over-year growth. I do anticipate going into the warmer months of 2019 that we're going to continue to have some significant growth throughout the year. You'll see that in some of my gas forecasting here in a moment or other material that the Pipeline Authority puts out. Slide 4, there was a question just a few minutes ago about how does this change in production compare to past changes. So again, going back, the top half of this graphic being the crude oil month-to-month changes and seeing that December of 2016 being the largest month-over-month decrease that the industry has seen. So again, this is a sizable shift in production month-to-month, but it's not something that the industry hasn't dealt with before. And again, as Lynn alluded to, with prices where they're at, with activity levels where they're at, not a concerning issue with what we know for March and April and going forward. So when we look at how that crude oil was moving out of the region, very little shifts again, January to February, no big market changes. You're looking at just slightly more market share on the pipeline movements, a little less market share on the rail movements. Again, with that large production decrease that the region saw, basically all modes of transportation were down on a volume basis and just some minor changes on a market share basis. Again, that long-term trend, we're continuing to see pipeline volumes and pipeline market share continuing to dominate as it has for the last couple of years within the region. Again, that Brent WTI spread being important in how those barrels, if there's a barrel not committed to a pipeline system or other mode of transportation, again, it has that flexibility to look at what the marketplace is doing, whether it gets on a rail car, whether it gets into one of the pipeline systems. Overall, again, with that production slide, we did see volume slide as well on the crude by rail out of the region, now estimated to be somewhere in that 250, 270,000 barrel per day range. Question about where those barrels are going. This is using the EIA information from January is the most recent. Again, 55% in January was estimated to be moving towards the west coast or PAD 5. The remainder going to the east coast, and then some rising market share down to the Gulf Coast. When we look at PAD refinery acquisition costs for January, again, the highest priced markets on the east and west coast, followed up by the Gulf Coast. And then with the markets where they are as of about lunchtime today, just over a $7 spread, that Brent WTI. So again, that's getting closer to that range where that tipping point of whether a barrel prefers to get on a pipeline system, whether it prefers to get on a rail network. Again, if that WTI spread, Brent WTI spread were closer to 9 or 10 as it was for much of last year, those economics really favor that crude by rail movement. As it starts to approach that $6, $5 spread level, and we typically start to see barrels trying to gain access on one of the pipeline networks. Again, those are barrels that are not already committed to one of those systems. Movements north-south of the border, truck and rail. Again, imports coming down through Canada. Again, these may be barrels coming in by truck as well as train traffic coming through the North Dakota border ports. And then as well, exports saw an abnormal spike late last year. And then again, kind of leveling off in January, which was the most recent information available. From a flaring perspective, percentage-wise, no change January to February, at least for the non-confidential data. We did see a slight shift in this pie graphic. We saw more gas being flared from connected wells, and then that blue piece of the pie being wells that don't have a pipeline connection. That share did shrink in February. Slide 13, the last 3 months have been consistent 19% on the non-confidential flaring, with just minor fluctuations in the root cause of that gas flaring. Again, shifting now more towards the connected facilities versus the unconnected. February, again, as activity as a whole was down, we did see new wells selling gas, that well count down. New wells getting connected to gas sales was down again. Just a much lower pace of activity, not only for the producing community, but as well the gas capture community. When we look forward, again, the expectation is that as we come out of this February downturn as far as production is related, I do anticipate that March, April, we will see a bounce back in production, followed by growth as we move into the rest of 2019. Again, we've talked about this in detail in the past. We do anticipate that by late this year, that gas capture infrastructure should start to catch up in a significant manner and start reducing some of the flare volumes and increase that overall gas capture volume and percentage. Then the long-term viewpoint, again, is still very robust growth for natural gas in the region. So we are working on, again, those next set of solutions that will need to be in place in the next 2 to 3 years in order to continue to stay on top of the gas capture requirements. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
This might not be for you, Justin, but the gas capture flaring, was it 81% in February?
Yes.
On the non-confidential was, and I think it was the same with confidential was.
Yes,
Correct.
we have 19.2% flared. So
Okay, well, we usually try to flare 15% or under
12.
12. Okay,
Our target is 12.
with the new rules from November.
Yes.
Okay, let's see.
We did have the one question earlier about where barrels would go to, and I think you covered it a little bit, but I don't know if you wanted to go in any more detail just on if the Washington bill passes, where barrels could be displaced to.
Yeah, again, the one thing with rail movements, it's very market driven. And so again, that is one of the benefits of using crude by rail. It does have flexibility and marketing flexibility. So if you look at slide 8 and you look back historically, you've seen just about every corner of the U.S. Being a delivery point for crude by rail out of North Dakota. So again, it started in the Midwest, crude by rail heading down to Cushing, followed up by the Gulf Coast, the St. James markets, followed up by the East Coast being the dominant destination, now PAD 5, the West Coast being the dominant destination. So there is infrastructure in place around the U.S. It's going to be market driven. So without knowing what the markets are doing and the timing of that, it's real difficult to say exactly what would take place if it stays on rail, if there's pipeline expansion opportunities. So it's real early to say, but it is something that has been very dynamic, at least historically in North Dakota.
Do you know how much crude is, I think we had mentioned it earlier, but how much crude is shipped from North Dakota to Washington approximately?
So roughly, so if you look at, using the February numbers of right around 250,000 barrels per day, and you look and say, okay, if February was similar to the graphic on slide 8, 55% of that, I hesitate to do math just off the top of my head and during a press conference, but it's going to be somewhere. If you calculate that, whether it's 150,000 barrels per day in that neighborhood, 175,000, as we've seen in the past. So, yeah.
And would we anticipate a possible production decline with the passing of that bill?
I don't anticipate that. Again, with the flexibility that's in place, I don't anticipate a production impact.
Any other questions for Justin?
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.